Well, good morning, everybody. This middle of the week, Wednesday, in the middle of summer. Hope you're doing well. In our Bible reading plan, we're in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 11 today. Chapter 11, 1 Corinthians. And you already know this, but what I wrote at the top of my journal after reading this chapter is, man, this was a messed up church. They argued about everything. They were divided over so many issues. And in this chapter, Paul deals with two more. He's already dealt with several issues, but he's dealing with two more things that they were divided over. One was head coverings in worship, and the other was, the Lord's Supper. The head coverings he talks about in the first half of the chapter down through verse 16, and it can really get confusing because you have kind of an interplay between what were the cultural norms and customs of that part of the world, the customs that had come out of Judaism, which some of the believers in this church had come from. Some of those customs were influenced by the Old Testament, but not necessarily commandments of God in the Old Testament. And so it can get really confusing when you're reading all of this, but he, at the end, gives us the guiding principle for dealing with this issue as well as others. In verses 11 and 12, he says, however, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, Eve taken from Adam's rib in Genesis, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. So he says in the end, because we are in Christ, some of these distinctions go away. And some of this stuff is, head coverings is not as important, but you're to be sensitive to cultural norms. In verses 13 and following, he says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself. It's just kind of their culture, their interpretation of what, natural law, what they just observe when they look at the world, that if a man has long hair, it is dishonor to him. But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But there's no commands of God about this. The idea is that in their culture, the custom in their church was that when a woman prayed or prophesied, he mentions earlier in this chapter, her head would be covered. And it would be an embarrassment for a woman to shave her head. So her long hair was considered her head covering. A man should not have long hair. So it's just the customs there. And he's saying, would y'all just stop fighting over this stuff? Pay attention to your customs and just stop fighting about it. Now, the Lord's Supper issue was more problematic because in Corinthians, and what we find in other readings, is they had this practice. It was common in some of the early churches of having we would think of it today as a potluck dinner every time they had the Lord's Supper, so people would bring food. Well, what happened was, those who had more, those who were wealthy were bringing a lot of stuff, and those who were poor, and a lot of the early Christians, came out of slavery. They didn't have much. Well, they didn't bring as much. And in this chapter, the picture that's painted is, rather than sharing with everybody, the rich with all their food would get there first, and they'd have a big old party, and they would pig out and actually get drunk at times. And by the time the poor people kind of wandered in, there wasn't sharing. It's like, this family brought their food and ate it, and we didn't care if anybody else had anything or not. And because they were taking the Lord's Supper in such an unworthy way, he mentions here that some of them were sick and some of them had died because they were abusing the Lord's Supper. So they would have this potluck dinner that really turned into selfishness and lack of sensitivity and even drunkenness on the part of some. And then they would sort of tack on the Lord's Supper at the end of that. And so Paul in this chapter reminds them of what the real meaning of the Lord's Supper is. And he even says in verse 34, the remaining matters I will arrange when I come. The end of verse 34. In other words, there were other issues. So Paul, this whole book is dealing with one issue after another that divided them. They were fighting over. And he said, and I can't even write you about all of it. Some of it I'm just going to have to deal with when I visit you. Now, having said all that, I think the Corinthian church is a warning to us today in the church. If this Corinthian church was messed up and fighting about everything, well, that's how our culture is. I mean, America's like that. And what we as a church have to be careful of, what we as God's people have to be careful of is that we don't allow the divisiveness of the world to come into the church and change us. That we don't act like the culture. We don't act like the world. That we work hard at maintaining unity and fellowship. And fighting over all this stuff, he says, destroys the church. And a word of caution is that we don't allow the politics of the world, the economic issues of the world, all the divisiveness of the culture. We bring all that into the church and we start fighting among ourselves from different perspectives. When we do that, we are as messed up as the Corinthian church, and God will judge us just like he judged them. That's the word for today. I'll see you tomorrow.